Tēnā katoa, ko Paul Holmes, te kaunga. My name's Paul Holmes, Managing Director, Info by Design, and welcome to this Privacy Week webinar about managing privacy and data in the generative and AI era. Just wanted to let you know that we'll probably wait about another 30 seconds or so just to allow the last attendees to arrive, and then we'll get cracking into the content. With me and helping to present this webinar on managing privacy and data in the generative AI era, I've got two great associates. So I've got John Cunningham, who is the Vice President General Manager, Asia Pacific and Middle East for Securiti, and Jack Berkowitz, who is the Chief Data Officer for Securiti. And thank you both really kindly for being here today and taking time out of your days to join in from an international perspective into New Zealand's Privacy Week. So John is dialing in from Sydney, Australia, and Jack is dialing in from America. So we've got a really good international set of insights that are going to come through in this session. So obviously, with the way these webinars work, there is a question and answer function in the bottom there. So please, we will try and have some time for questions at the end. So please do use the Q&A function to, I guess, load your questions rather than in the chat. And yeah, otherwise we will just get cracking into it. And I'll hand over to John, who's going to start off sharing some insights around, I guess, what's happening internationally in the data and generative AI space and some of the things that need to be thought about in terms of putting effective governance around the risks associated with that. So John, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate the opportunity to be virtually in New Zealand today. Can't wait to get back there physically. I suppose one of the things to think about is that a lot of organisations in New Zealand, obviously with the New Zealand Privacy Act, are quite aware of the implications of that and GDPR type regulation. What we're seeing is that it's actually going to be more stringent when it comes to AI governance, and organisations are at that stage where they need to prepare a little bit differently to just the Privacy Act regulations around it, because a lot of things today in organisations, if we think about things like data governance, is around structured data. You've got your knife and fork drawer, occasionally a knife be in a fork drawer and a fork will be in a knife drawer or spoon drawer, but basically it's all in columns and rows. And we'd like to think that our unstructured data is organised similarly, where we know where everything is, we know the type of information that's there, and we really can utilise that information to have a full visibility to where we have personal information, where we have sensitive information in the organisation. The reality is that for most organisations, their unstructured data is everywhere. They haven't got a real grip on it. They're not sure what they've got, why they've got it, why they're still holding it, what's the retention around that data, and how it's being used, and how they're going to meet their privacy obligations around it. And when I say the privacy obligations, it's thinking about the privacy obligations when you move to a generative AI environment where your organisation is building their own AI capability. And just to set the context, we're not really talking about using Copilot or Perplexity or some other open AI type technology. The kind of framework today is you're going to be building AI pipes in your organisation. Therefore, what is the governance and privacy responsibility around the managing the end-to-end pipe from the prompt to where the data actually comes into it? And the difference is we're now talking about unstructured data. And that's the untapped value for the organisation that Jack will lead into his experiences on, around that you'll need a new set of capabilities to really understand unstructured data across the organisation. Now, some of the terminology we'll use will be quite familiar with privacy professionals. And what we're going to just touch on today is this 5-step approach to AI governance and safe Gen AI. And it's very, very simple to understand that this is going to be driven by the organisation and the business. And we're seeing that across Australia and New Zealand. I see it in Asia and even countries in Indonesia, whereby there are 50 AI models and projects going on that a lot of the people aren't aware of, including the privacy and the governance teams and the security teams. But essentially, you've got your data everywhere. It could be structured, it could be unstructured, but you need to really understand that data, then understand the models that are being utilised by the organisation. The models, agents, These are kind of sitting on top of the prompts. Now, if you've used OpenAI, you've used Perplexity or Copilot, you'll understand that you're talking to something in natural language. There are applications and different types of assistants, business processes, new types of apps, what we call agents, and bots that are going to be sitting on top of that to automatically derive insights around the data in your environment. Now, why is it going to be important? Is because from a business point of view, organizations are seeing this as an untapped opportunity to really go out and tap into and create differentiation, competitive differentiation, and new revenue streams for the organization, as well as improving, optimizing, reducing costs, and optimizing business processes in their organization. And this kind of brings out some new challenges. We're talking about, how do you actually learn these patterns? How do you gain insight to these patterns? But also, how does, at the same time, do you make sure the information that's coming from these large language models are protected? How do you make sure that someone is not going to attack you or try to attack your organization through the prompts? How do you actually protect the prompt? Now, if we think about a prompt is that Copilot, and you're going to ask a question of it, and you're going to ask that question in natural language, it's going to respond to you. So the organization needs to be able to actually understand and protect to make sure that inappropriate questions aren't asked, inappropriate answers are not provided from the prompt. And there's a lot of things that are going on around this environment as well globally. And there's examples of bias. There's examples of hallucination that are coming from these models. So it's very, very important to understand the models that your organization are using and the risks associated with those models. So what models exist? What are the security and privacy controls? What are the risks around those models? What data from your organization is flowing into those models? And then what are the controls that are in place? And then how do you ensure the AI models that you're utilizing are going to comply with global regulation? We've developed and we've worked globally with a lot of different organizations around a 5-step approach. And this is very much, if you kind of, I'm going to try to map this to your privacy along the way. So you need to understand what models are in the organization. So think about that. Once you understand the models, what's the risk associated with those models? Think of it in the old world of data mapping and a process or an application. Think about it running a PIA around those data models and then creating a data map around how that information flows from the organization to the model, from the model to the user and back through. And understanding that for each and every single application, or what we call pipe, that's been built within your organization. Then what are the controls you're going to put in place? How are you going to ensure that personal sensitive information that's going into those models is redacted, or you're aware of what information is being going into those models? And then how you put the controls around it. And then kind of finally, what are the compliance obligations that are going to be afforded to yourselves with potential regulation in New Zealand that dovetails into the Privacy Act with things around AI governance? There's significant overlap between what we see coming from the GDPR and the EU AI governance. So discovering the models and cataloging those models, there's really kind of two elements. Can it be done through automation, and can it be done through attestation? And that means, for example, the automation is potentially within your environment, analyzing your environment, understanding what type of models exist within your environment and what are your data scientists and your AI team working on. But then there's going to be, just like your vendor assessments, there's going to be a need to conduct a third-party risk analysis and assessment through attestation around what models are being used in the variety of SaaS applications you're using. And then you're going to need to have a catalog of those models to understand the risks associated with using it from your own pipes or using it through a third party. These models need to be then assessed from a risk point of view, around things like toxicity, bias, and hallucination. For example, there's a health AI model in the US that would recommend if you've got COVID that you go to Mexico and you treat it with bleach. And that all came from the information that Galsey and the president were on stage once when they actually mentioned that they're actually now being captured by the model and producing these sorts of hallucinations and misinformation back out to the public. Now, you need to understand how that affects you from an accuracy, fairness, bias, toxicity, and then overall risk to the organization from a privacy point of view. How does the information connect to your data stores? How do you understand the information that's coming from your data stores into your AI model? Does that information need to be extracted, then potentially cleansed, then put in a format that's friendly that the AI models use? It's called vectoring the information. So that's the kind of information you need to know. Then you need to actually have some sort of control of the information going into where the model accesses it. And then you also need the information to be controlled from the user through the prompt to ensure that that information is being accessed and only accessed in the manner it should be. And the same for the response going back. So let's think about when we do our data maps for ROPA, from collection to archival, we need to know the flow. But in this case, we're talking about an AI pipe within the organization. And then that would give you the visibility to work with your teams around how do you ensure that information going in is safe and is aligned to the organization's policies, but also the regulatory environment that you operate within. How do you know that it's classified correctly, anonymized correctly, and you're not putting highly sensitive personal information into these models? And then how do you facilitate things like we're familiar with in our privacy world around consent, access, deletion? How do we handle data subject access requests? And how do we ensure that they actually have compliance-driven disclosures around that information? And then, from a controls point of view, as I mentioned before, there's going to be bots, assistants, and humans asking questions. How do you make sure that they don't upload malicious information? How do you know someone doesn't put the company's payroll or a spreadsheet with a lot of personal data into these models and ensure that information doesn't go in, but also doubly ensure that it doesn't come out, and also questions that are asked of the AI is appropriate questions. So this is where you'd be working with your security teams and data governance teams in this area. So some of the things to think about in the pipeline is your involvement as privacy professionals around that data preparation. Where's the data coming from? How is it sanitized? How is it loaded into the systems? How are these AI models trained? Ensuring they're not trained with highly sensitive personal information from the organization. How do you actually know what those agents are doing and how the information is being pulled from and into the systems? And make sure that you're working with the security and governance teams to make sure they understand the privacy obligations of the organization to ensure that the controls are in place, that inappropriate questions and answers are not there to be provided through things around what we call natural language firewalls. And then how do you ensure that you can go to your and drive trust in the organization, and from the organization that you have a safe and compliant program around using data and AI. And then finally, how do you actually ensure that you're able to comply with the regulatory obligations? There's a lot of frameworks out there now, the NIST AI RMF, the EU AI Act. There's a lot going through. There's AI ROPA reports are going to be required. There's been a response in Australia to potentially enhancing what the governance and regulatory requirements are like. I'm sure Paul will speak to what's happening in New Zealand. So at a high level, that's the 5-step process that we believe you need to actually engage your organization with. There'll be the data teams, the security teams, they'll all be involved, but from a privacy obligation point of view, it's very clearly defined. This aligns very closely to the Privacy Acts, the GDPRs of the world, whereby you need to actually protect the information and only use the information of your consumers, your customers, of your employees, in a manner that you're actually demonstrating true custodialship of that. So you need full transparency of systems, visibility into the risks, clarity of how the information is processed, adequate protection around it, and you need to have an easy way of making sure you're compliant. So it's very high level. The slides will be available. We've got some free education that the link to will be available at the end of this when the team distribute the slides. But essentially, this is a free AI governance training capability and certification available to the public. That's really good. Just finished it again. The team have rewritten it. I highly recommend that that's something you embark on. So that's kind of the theory and the concept. I'm going to hand over now to Jack, who's got vast experience in doing this with large organizations with global operations.
Yeah, hi. So thanks for that, John. And just to plug that class, I've just retaken my certification myself. So super good class. Let me explain to you who I am, where I'm coming from. And I thought I'd just talk for a little bit, not a lot of slides, but I actually talk about some experiences, early experiences in building and deploying generative AI applications. My name's Jack Berkowitz. I'm actually in Atlanta, Georgia right now. And through the fall of last year, I was the enterprise chief data officer of a multinational corporation called ADP. It's the world's largest provider of HR and payroll services, operating in 140 countries around the world. And we were some of the first early adopters of the generative AI capabilities, both from the Azure OpenAI capabilities, so Microsoft and OpenAI's link up, as well as I think my team was the second or third group to get access to AWS's Bedrock and to be able to access not just the Anthropic models, but the other models that are behind Bedrock, including AWS's Titan. We were building a series of different use cases, and to John's point, we feel that this is really where companies are going to get their differentiated value is yes, you can use the off-the-shelf tools to get going, but really it's that combination of your data along with the large language models. Bringing those together is what allows you to get some differentiation, and that differentiation can be in lots of different ways. One way can be just accelerating your customer success or your customer support, either by enabling your end customers to have access to information, or making your call center or your support team way more efficient in interacting and supporting customers. Because one of the great things about generative AI is it allows you to fuse a lot of different information together in context. Another area might be related to building new products, or to building or doing a better job servicing, or selling products. All sorts of different things are going to come out. And the key to that is really to start by, identifying those use cases and working on those use cases as a business group. So one of the things that we experienced, and now, since joining Securiti at the turn of the new year, my job is to work with C-levels at multinationals across the world on building helping and advising them building their experiences. One of the big results is that partnership between privacy, the data office, and whether you have a chief data office, whether that's inside of your IT organization, or whether it's a joint AI and data office put together, and security now is tighter than it's ever been. It's no good to just have different groups operating independently, because a lot of these different concerns have to be made aware to everybody. And so one of the things that we did back actually in early 2019 was to stand up what we called a data and AI ethics board, to actually look not only at use cases, but actually look at how we were building responsible AI and how we were going to implement systems as they go. Now, obviously, the things from OpenAI and the things that we see every day now coming at us weren't available back in 2019, but we had an inkling that these things were coming. So the first thing is to stand up and establish the principles that you as privacy teams, but also as the company wants to accomplish. And actually, you'll see this in the guidance on how to implement things like NIST AI RMF or the EU AI Act. They really talk about standing up that committee of stakeholders to understand and discuss. And I think that's the most important thing, to discuss those capabilities. Now, what we ended up doing is actually issuing and listing our 7 statements of the principles that our company was going to live and live behind, and actually put those forward to our clients and made sure that all of our clients got notification about that. We had 1 million clients at my last company, and again, operating in 140 countries. So when you have 1 million clients, you need to make sure that you're effective in that communication. And it's interesting, what we decided to do, because we dealt with people data, is actually not to maybe go as extreme on certain types of principles. So for example, in terms of bias, a lot of people, particularly in the privacy world, will immediately say, well, you can't have something biased. The reality is that data and decision making is biased, right? So what we decided to do is make sure that it was clear that not that we were going to say things are not biased, but that we would assess and quantify the bias, make people aware as to when we saw bias. That turns out to be, those types of value decisions that you need to think about as you're putting together a privacy program around AI, and particularly around Gen AI. The second area then is, once you get going on deciding what those use cases are and how to prosecute them, is all those steps that John was outlining, particularly around the data. Most of your high value use cases aren't going to be, without context or without customer information somehow folded into the response. You want to give it the context of your business, or your users are trying to give it the context of their business for advice back. And in that case, you need to be able to control that. You need to be able to have, for example, tokenization, which is a form of anonymization where you can rejoin afterwards. So you remove the identifiable information as it goes over to the LLM, but you put in a placeholder token. So it's not John Cunningham going across, it's just a encoding of letters or numbers or something. But when the response comes back, it rejoins. And so then your user is able to understand that in context. And so you can describe aspects of people using metadata, aspects of companies and your clients using metadata, or other characteristics, such that you can get an important and good answer back from these systems. My team had fielded, systems being used by thousands of people across the world by using these types of techniques. They meet the privacy requirements, but they also meet, importantly, the business goals as you're going forward. The last area that I wanted to really focus in on for you as you're building out these systems is this idea of monitoring the systems. The days of, hey, I'm going to do a record of processing and I'm going to put it on a PowerPoint and then we'll go look at it, at some point in the future, or maybe just, show the regulator or show the groups that, hey, we did this. That's not going to be good enough. The change of technology is so rapid in this area that you're going to need living systems to help you monitor and understand what's going on. Now, obviously, the ones that everybody thinks about, particularly around, firewalls or around AI governance, is, hey, you don't want the system to hallucinate something about somebody's, ethnicity or something very personal, using improper language. And that's an obvious thing. But there's all sorts of different characteristics that you want to be able to see, and you want to measure and monitor in a live system. So your data science teams or your IT teams, you should really push on them to make sure that you're able to see right alongside of them. This is going to be a side-by-side partnership to be able to see what's going on with the systems, to make sure that you're safeguarding that information, and to make sure that things are updated appropriately. It needs to be a live system, because again, today you might be using the OpenAI model that was released 2 weeks ago. yesterday or Monday here in the States, they released a new model, and it's now available. And that has new characteristics, new capabilities, new ways of interacting with it. And so therefore you need a system that is able to adapt, able to be understood, and able to be tracked. Now, over the previous year, over in 2023, most of the systems had to be implemented by hand, and they were costly to be able to do that. So a lot of companies have been sitting back away from going to production because of the amount of effort and energy and lift it was taking to actually, get the privacy teams, get the legal teams, get everybody important, the heads of the company comfortable with the risk associated. But today, and here in the States, but all around the world, you're starting to see new technologies coming available that allow data teams, that allow your teams to be able to monitor things in real time and to control the edges around these models, such that you can actually get a business use out of them and not just an entertainment use. And so these things are now cost effective. And there's no reason why you shouldn't be starting to do that. Like John said, the first step is actually know where your data is, know what models you have running. And that always becomes interesting. And we work with clients all the time, small clients, and they think, oh, well, we don't have any models running. And it turns out that you do. You have models running in the software that you're subscribing to, whether it's something like Salesforce or an HR system or an ERP system. But you also have models that your teams are actively building and deploying. And so assessing the data, and taking that 5-step process that John was outlining is really the first step towards it. Gartner actually has written a little bit deeper on that. There's a thing called the Gartner Trust Risk. I'm going to mess up the name of it, but it's called the Gartner Trism. You can find it on the Gartner website. And the Gartner Trism essentially maps to those same places. So super happy to be sharing kind of my experiences building, deploying at massive volume, early generative AI systems, working with the different vendors, and then where these things are going. So again, 3-4 things, easy to do. Start with your governance committee. Make sure that it is multidisciplined. Make sure that you have somebody from the business there. And then the technical things follow right along well. And that's really it. So why don't I hand it back to John and Paul, and we'll continue on.
Cool. Thanks very much, Jack. Great. And fantastic to get some international insights here as part of New Zealand Privacy Week on, I guess, what's happening in the AI adoption space. So I will just wrap up with a few slides, and then we've got some time at the end for questions. So if anyone does want to ask any questions of either myself or Jack or John, please do use the Q&A function in the webinar, and we will get to those at the end. And obviously, Jack and John have highlighted the fact that AI is big, it's complex, it's happening really fast, and it's really important for organizations to be looking at it from a multidisciplinary approach. And from a privacy perspective, given that this is Privacy Week, obviously AI has big impacts in terms of what we need to be thinking about as privacy and information security professionals, and how we manage and put the right things in place within our organizations to help be across them and be effective in our roles. And fundamentally, obviously, this technology is happening. Privacy isn't going to be killed by it. It will change what privacy means and what we as privacy professionals need to be doing and thinking about, just like all of the other technological changes that we've had over time. And obviously, within the New Zealand context, our Privacy Act, I guess helpfully here, is written in a technology agnostic fashion. So it's principles based, and the principles and the IPPs within it do apply to the use of AI just as equally as they do to the collection of some information from an individual on a paper-based form. And our job as privacy professionals and privacy officers is to be able to help translate the IPPs and help ensure that that is one of the inputs into the governance discussions and the decisions that our organizations are making. So we need to think of it in that way in terms of it's something that's going to continue to change, but we need to be able to, I guess, adopt and change with it. And obviously, one of the things that is really important to be able to do this effectively is to be able to get an understanding of what information that could be going through these models or could be used to train these models is sensitive. And that's really important to be able to assess the risk posture and the control adequacy around these types of models. So it's going to require us as privacy officers to be working with our information security and information management, data governance colleagues to come up with common definitions of what is sensitive information, because obviously we have a number of different uses of that terminology. But what are the types of informations that have a greater risk of, misuse, loss, etc., through these new technologies, and how can we make sure that we've got the right ability to flag and define them? And then, as John and Jack have both touched on, looking at some of the technological controls to minimize the likelihood of these being exposed inappropriately through the new systems and models that are being used. The OPC's new draft code on biometric processing is a great example for those of you who have reviewed or seen that over the last few weeks. They've just closed their consultation on it. In terms of looking at biometric processing, which a lot of it's things like facial recognition are AI driven, and looking at how do we do it. And one of the tests that the OPC have proposed in there is a proportionality assessment. So having the ability to identify what are these sensitive categories of information, and then working with your colleagues to make sure that you're all on the same page with that is going to be really important for enabling effective governance and effective feeding into these models. We also need, obviously, to consider the ethical implications of using these AI tools and the potential impacts on individuals where AI models are making decisions that could affect them. And I really like Jack's point before about the fact that there will be bias, because whatever data you're training on will have some level of inherent bias, and it's really important for us to be able to understand what that bias may be so we can explain it, and also factor in the human interactions or human interventions that may be needed there. So you might not be able to provide a full list of details of exactly how a model works, but looking at basically being able to say for a model what data it was trained on, how and why it's being used, what decisions are being made by it, who will be impacted and how, what personal information is involved in that, and how the data will be secured and stored. So these are things that we should be able to, for each of these use cases that we're looking at, be able to work with our technical teams to explain as best as possible. And if we can't answer those questions, then that's an area where we've probably got a little bit of a problem and some risk that we're running. The other thing that's really important in terms of the transparency space is making sure that our customers are aware of that, or the individuals that we're dealing with, whether they be staff members, stakeholders, etc. So helping to make sure that when people are interacting with an AI model, not a human, they are aware of that, making sure that also they're aware of how there are controls in place to make sure that if there are these biased decisions or inappropriate decisions, that they can be picked up and addressed early. Unfortunately, in the facial recognition trial that we've got running at one of our large supermarket chains at the moment, there was a classic case of this that came out pretty quickly and early on in the trial, where a young Māori woman was going into the shop to get her groceries and was identified or flagged by the facial recognition system as someone who had been accused of shoplifting, and despite human verification being in place, was confronted by the staff members of the particular supermarket and came out incredibly upset because it wasn't her, and it was clear when you actually looked at the photo that it wasn't her, but effectively she came out feeling racially profiled and felt really vulnerable as a result of an inappropriate decision made by a system, even with human interaction in place. So the more that we can be transparent about what we're doing and how, and the more that we can make sure that we are committing to that, the better. Alongside that, the other capability that we have to build up is our people. So they're probably the biggest vulnerability that we have in terms of the use of AI, but also the biggest opportunity to make sure that we are able to identify where issues are. One thing that is for sure is that these AI tools, even if you don't have a formal AI program, will be being used by your staff members in a work capacity. Microsoft and LinkedIn just recently published some studies, or a study that was pretty sobering in terms of highlighting that based on the people who they had surveyed, 84% of workers were using Gen AI tools to boost their productivity. And 78% of people said that they're bringing their own AI tools into the digital workplace to do it. So again, obviously from a data security, data privacy perspective, we have struggled with, effectively the bring your own device type challenges, and also the shadow IT challenges. Now we've got the shadow AI challenges that are coming through as well. So the more that we can have structured programs to help educate our staff and our third parties that we work with around what is okay and what is acceptable and what is not within our organizations, the better we are going to be able to make sure that we're adopting these technologies in a safe, appropriate, and systemic way rather than just hoping for the best. And really, having the right governance capabilities in place to be able to do that is essential. So Jack talked about having a governance committee where these types of discussions can happen. John touched on the multidisciplinary nature of it, and it is really important that we do have this multidisciplinary capability to be able to look at and make informed, structured decisions about these risks. Within our organizations, obviously, as if we're sitting there as the privacy officer for an organization, we're one voice, and we have an important role to play in this, but we can't do it alone. And so we need to make sure that there is, one, the capability and understanding of these technologies and the risks at our executive and board level, which is a really, only just starting to emerge now. And for those of us in the privacy and security space know how much of a challenge it's been just educating and getting awareness at the board level on privacy and security over the last years. But given the pace of change and the pace of opportunity associated with these new technologies, it's really important that we do have this. Thinking about, like we have a privacy officer, whether it's appropriate to have a chief AI officer within your organization who is responsible for coordinating. And that could be, similar to, it could be an actual full-time role, or it could be someone's position entitled to sit across that governance forum and help to be able to make sure it happens. Alongside that, having the roles and responsibilities for decision-making and adoption really clearly defined at both the board and the executive level, right down through the organization to what's acceptable and what's not acceptable for frontline staff in the use of these tools. Having a governance board, obviously touched on that, but using that governance board and your board and executive to be able to define a risk appetite for your adoption or decision making around AI. So what is your desired speed of adoption? What are the acceptable or unacceptable use cases that may be there at the moment? What are the types of data that are either no-goes or have to be masked or anonymized before they can be used to train or put through these types of systems? And then using that risk appetite to inform some sort of AI adoption and use policy to be able to provide clear directions out to your staff and your third-party stakeholders you work with around how you manage it. And a third-party suppliers policy on top of that as well. So as Jack mentioned, a lot of the use cases you'll have for these new model-based or LLM capabilities will be coming in through your third-party vendors that you already work with, potentially vendors that you have already done privacy and security assessments for and are operating in your ecosystem. And you may have the AI deployed into your organization by stealth in terms of, it just comes through in their next update without you having the ability to take a structured risk assessment and measured approach to making a decision about whether you're willing to adopt that and whether you're willing to have it run over that type of data or not. And then obviously updating things like your privacy and security assessments to make sure that they do factor in the potential for AI, automated decision-making and other things to change the risk profile and have the ability to tease them out and identify what controls are needed, whether they be some of the technical controls like LLM firewalls, etc., like John talked about, or just manual decision-making controls where people have to actually make a decision to accept a risk. Vendor assessment processes are also really important in that space. And I guess one thing that I know from working with a number of organizations is it's not done particularly well and it's not done regularly. So I think, looking at how can you better assess your vendors, but also more frequently assess your vendors, because just because you approved something 2.5 years ago, doesn't mean that the risk profile still stays the same. It doesn't mean that they still have the same risk posture. So yeah, thinking about those sorts of things and the reporting up to your governance forums as well around where are you using these, what are you seeing from it, and how are you monitoring the performance of these over time so that as you identify things like bias, hallucinations, etc. coming through, you can report them up to help your governance functions make informed decisions about the risk that you're potentially running within the business. And then lastly, I think the other thing, going back to that concept of transparency, that's really important, is to have some form of external transparency statement that helps to make it clear to, I guess, the public, your customers, your stakeholders, how and where you're using these types of artificial intelligence and generative AI technologies, and how you're making sure that they're being used in a safe, appropriate, reasonable, responsible, and measured way, so that obviously the benefits can be derived for people, but the risks, as much as possible for things like bias, can be mitigated or at least minimized. So that's the content that we had for sort of formal discussion. I think one of the great things about these types of events is the ability to then have some question and answer type sessions. So please do use the Q&A function and ask some questions. We have a couple in there already. So Jack and John, I might ask you to jump back online quickly. And so the first question is, I was told that it wasn't the AI read the supermarket case, it was human error. So there was obviously media reporting about this in New Zealand, and Jack and John, you probably aren't familiar with it necessarily. But basically, for safety and security reasons, the supermarket chain over here is running a facial recognition trial. They've got the Office of the Privacy Commissioner involved, and they are monitoring the trial, which I think is a really fantastic way of approaching it. But unfortunately, unintended consequence, one of the things that happened was a woman was wrongly profiled. As we know, with facial recognition technologies, they do tend to adversely or be less effective in, I guess, identifying people of colour or females. And unfortunately, this was a Māori woman in New Zealand who was misidentified by the system. And then the human-based controls around it, which it was meant to be reviewed before any action was taken by an individual, weren't effective in terms of the people just took it and went with it. And so, yes, this was an element of human error, but I think the other important thing to note is, when we're designing our controls, and going back to my point around making sure our people are trained appropriately, I think there was a systemic underlying issue here in terms of, the AI is known to be potentially biased. It put out a biased or an incorrect result, and therefore an individual was quite significantly adversely affected as a result of it. So Jack, John, not sure if you've got any sort of other examples or other things to touch on.
I think, I have one that isn't as severe, but I think it gets into not bias, but actually a company's responsibility, the principle about understanding how things are built and how things are done. So you may have seen this. It was, I want to say 6 weeks ago now, maybe 8 weeks ago, Air Canada example. So Air Canada lost a lawsuit in Toronto where somebody had basically applied for bereavement fares. So, asked a chatbot, a generative AI chatbot, hey, do you offer bereavement fares? And the system came back and said, yeah, we do, 50% off. And so they purchased the ticket. Later on, they found out that they paid full price, sued Air Canada for all of $800 or $671 or $871. I don't remember what it was. It wasn't a huge lawsuit, but it was interesting because what Air Canada's defense is that they weren't responsible for the behavior of the chatbot, that they weren't responsible for something on their own system. See, because somewhere else on their website, it said that they don't honor bereavement fares. And what the Canadian court said is, well, no, actually, you as a company are responsible as the provider of this technology in any sense, and whoever trained it, for the response, for the behavior. And that basic notion of responsibility in that lawsuit, to a practitioner like myself, it's like, well, of course you're responsible for it. But it's an interesting thing to see that they went all the way to court. Now, Air Canada obviously didn't like the publicity of this. And I don't know anything specifically about how Air Canada built their chatbot. I know how other airlines build theirs. But, it wasn't, I think a lot of people have said, well, it hallucinated about it. And I actually don't believe that it hallucinated. I just believe that, that basic principle that John was talking about, find and know your data to start, find and know your models to start. the way the system was built, somebody built it, probably sent an email to somebody in HR or legal and said, send me the documents so we can train the chatbot. Somebody sent them some documents, but the website was built by marketing with a different set of documents. And this is, having built systems for 30 years, this type of problem is pretty much probably what happened, because you're going to see that over and over again. So having those pipelines to understand, improve the data and everything, it's not like anybody was trying to be nefarious. It's just normal system building behavior inside of companies. So I thought that was an interesting example, not as bad as yeah.
Oh, excellent. Cool. We've got another question here, and it's a great question, actually, so thank you. Setting up an AI governance committee and the right measures in place isn't something that's going to happen overnight. So do you have any suggestions about how to incrementally put a proper governance structure in place when the resources are not available to mobilize the right measures quickly? So Jack, maybe I'll put it to you in terms of your journey of setting up that committee and where you started with first, and then John and I can jump in with anything else.
Yeah, it was funny. We actually started it, me, the chief privacy officer, and somebody from our compliance team, which was different than our privacy team, over lunch. So we would meet at lunch and have lunch meetings. And from there, it became a full-grown thing with staff and everything else. But it started with, hey, how are we going to do this? And we wrote literally on a piece of paper. Remember when we all used paper back in 2019? But we wrote on a piece of paper our principles around lunch. So it doesn't have to have a full formalization and everything to get going, to have the conversations to start thinking. Before we knew it, it was discussed at the executive level, and I presented it to the board of directors of our company. And then I had staff members and everything else. So I would say the thing is just get going and just figure out how to get it done.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion, Jack. And I think, that's my experience too in organizations is, you don't have to start off with, we want to start, so we're going to go straight to the board and ask for formal endorsement to set something up. I guess as a privacy officer, as a CISO, as a chief data officer, you have these responsibilities embedded within your roles. So starting to talk to your key colleagues about how can we work together to make this happen. And then once you've got a bit of a framework around it, then starting to say, okay, well, how can we make this a formal part of our governance rather than just the right people sitting around a table having a discussion?
Yeah, and just so you know, I had to pay for the first lunch, but we stuck the privacy officer for the full bill later on when it went to the board and he got, present to the board of directors. Then we stuck him with the bill.
Excellent. Excellent. There's more questions coming through. I'm asking the ones where people have upvoted them first. So if there are particular questions that you want emphasized, or if you have more, please fire them through. We've still got about 12 minutes of time for questions, so we've got time to get through a few. The next one that's being rapidly upvoted as I look at it is, do you have any advice for privacy teams dealing with tech teams that don't want a handbrake from rolling out AI technologies and refuse to go through privacy and security checks? So just quickly from me, just from having been a privacy officer in organizations and working with a number of them, I think it really is starting to build those relationships with people. And fundamentally going back to that first thing of, the Privacy Act in New Zealand is an enabling piece of legislation. It tells you how to do it safely. And so rather than having the conversations around, you can't do this because I need to be across it, it's, I can help you to do this in the right way to get the best outcomes for our customers in a safe and compliant way. So I think starting the discussion there, and how can I work with you to help you get things done faster rather than, being viewed as a barrier, is a really important piece of that discussion. Maybe Jack, just from a sort of the technology side or the chief data officer side, what would you see?
Yeah, by all means, because your chief data officer, your chief AI officer, or your CIO, however you want to do it, they're getting tasked by your CEO to go, right? Every CEO is being told right now, or is either being told by their board or is going to wherever CEOs go. I always thought they all just went to New Zealand, but that's what we read about, right? So when they're in their New Zealand bunker, right, that's where all the CEOs hang out. But they're all saying, hey, we're going to differentiate. We want to go take advantage of that $4 trillion that John was pointing out. So they're being told to go, and it's a business imperative to go. And so really it's exactly what you said. It's that partnership that makes sense, and understand the pressures that they're under. I think the way that I look at it after building reasoning systems for so long, and that's what these are, a form of reasoning system, is really what you're talking about is just good engineering. Really what you're talking about is just good system development. And any engineer with their weight is going to be, oh, well, that's the proper way of building systems. And so, yeah, there may be one or two people who are like wanting to cut corners, but any engineer pretty much would understand that this is a proper thing. Of course, they want to monitor how the systems do it. Of course, they want to make sure that it's not giving wrong answers. Engineers thrive on the correctness of things. And so I think if you put it to them like, hey, this is just good engineering, I think that's a way to approach it. And do that gently to an engineer, trust me. But
Hey, Paul, there's a one
Yep.
question I just put into the chat that's pretty relevant question to ask. Do you want to?
Okay.
I think Jack or yourself, Jack might be the best one to answer it.
Yeah, that was the one I was going to ask next. So good spotting, John. So it is there any independent assurance of the AI models and systems? How can we know they're doing what they say in their policy statements, such as not storing data or using it for training?
yeah, I wish there was. I wish there was an underwriter labs for software and AI models. There isn't anything like that yet. There are committees that are being stood up. In fact, just reminds me I need to send an email out tomorrow morning. But there are committees being stood up and independent bodies that are editing and auditing. Right now, most of those groups are focused in on correctness measures, not necessarily on compliance or this type of check. There are a number of companies, though, looking at, for example, supply chain vulnerabilities in the models themselves, either in the data or in the model software. Just like you can have a software supply chain attack, you could have a model supply chain attack. And so I think you're going to see this certification type authority or the certification effort over the next couple of years on these large language models, but none that exist today. Like nobody can tell you that how Snowflake's model works versus Databricks versus, Anthropic's, and, Anthropic's marketing line is we do it responsibly. How? Well, trust us, right? So you need to really, push on that, understand it, and just control for the fact that you just need to build your systems in response and just think ahead as to what you want to do. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Jack. That's great. Next question is one directed at John. You talked about ropers in relation to AI. Is there an updated approach you'd recommend to ensure all processes are captured, or just something we need to be aware of when we are completing them?
Yeah, we'll get some of that to Paul and get him to share it out. But effectively, it's a roper type model, assessment type model for your basically end-to-end Gen AI pipe and understanding what it is, where it is, and that sort of stuff. So, but you also got to think about some of this is going to be a little bit different to what you're used to, and think about lineage for unstructured data, capturing that flow of who's interacting with that model, how that model's been interacting with the data, and that whole pipeline. So we'll get some stuff together, get it to Paul and the team to get out. But definitely similar, but slightly different approach around it, because as Jack said, this needs to be real time. This is data flowing across your organization, and it happens in near real time. So you need to be able to discover and understand an appropriate risk in a real time world across. One of the clients I'm working with in the Middle East, a bank, has got over 50 pipes being developed. There's an organization in Australia we're working with has already got 150 different types of pipes being developed with no governance. So definitely something's evolving, but we'll get some stuff out.
Awesome. Thanks, John. And there's a great comment in the Q&A as well. I studied this 30 years ago. Yeah, none of this is new. At the end of the day, the technologies or the things underlying the technologies have been around for a long time. Really, the main change is the level of data available and the level of processing capability available to make these models much more advanced and much more complex and much more aligned to human thinking than they would be before. But it is a really good point. And, I think a lot of the discussions that we're having these days around AI and AI governance, feel very deja vu to me to the discussions we were having in around 2010 around cloud. In terms of, we knew it was scary. It was new, it was scary, it was unknown, and now everything's in the cloud. And we had some organizations who were early adopters who went full noise and got burnt. We had others who were early adopters who did it in a structured way, or were lucky and didn't get burnt. And we had a whole heap of other organizations who sat and did nothing for 4 or 5 years waiting for something to happen and missed out on all those potential benefits. And I think the key thing with the AI, and Jack or John, maybe any last comments before we wrap up on that is, the 4 to 5 year wait and getting burnt, the equivalent timescale in terms of AI feels like it's more like 12 to 18 months in that sense.
Yeah.
I think 2018, 2017, we're doing a lot of work with another company on AI. We're talking about AI versus generative AI. AI can tell you a tomato is a fruit. It can't tell you not to put it in fruit salad. Generative AI can tell you a tomato is a fruit. Why? Because of the way it seeds, where it germinates, and all these different things. And it can actually then make a recommendation that, though it's typically not used in fruit salad, should you wish to your particular taste want tomato in your fruit salad, you're able to do it. And that's the difference in between AI and generative AI, is the context and the application of additional knowledge points to the actual questions you're asking. So highly recommend you jump on Perplexity or some of these different ones out there, OpenAI, and just have a play. Have a play. There's a lot of free ones out there, and just ask some questions and see what type of responses you're getting.
Yep.
Absolutely. And we did have a couple of last questions come through last minute, so we've got a couple of minutes, so we'll just ask them. So the first one's for Jack. What's the American federal government doing in terms of regulatory policies and governance and making sure these organizations comply?
Yeah, so in classic way, right, the EU passed a regulation to bind everything down and lock everything down. The US government's doing it a little slightly differently. So three major things going on. First of all, the White House issued a executive order requiring agencies, and then anybody who supplies to the agencies, to operate essentially the type of programs that we were talking about today. That means it's going to happen because everybody ends up doing business with the federal government. The second thing is the regulators are essentially saying to the companies, look, we already have regulations about how to operate trustworthy businesses. In particular, the Treasury Department and the Federal Trade Commission are starting to issue what they call sweep orders, where they're actually collecting information from major companies, listed companies, banks, people like that, or organizations like that, to document these processes. Show us your processes. Show us what you've got. And it's interesting for the FTC to do it because Federal Trade Commission isn't just banks. It's anybody who sells a product in the US that has potentially negative impacts on the consumer. And, they're saying, look, consumer law already covers all this. So there's not, and so therefore they're moving faster, actually. There's not going to be like a big Schrems 3 lawsuit or something that everybody's going to wait 5 years to go through the courts to see what happens. There seems to be another court thing in Austria coming up right now, similar to Schrems. That'll freeze the EU. Everybody will argue about it for the next 5 years. But in the meantime, in the US, the FTC, Treasury, they're going after it. The last thing is EEOC in the US, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, which has major impact on US business in terms of employees and everybody, has made similar statements. So EEOC commissioner, I know one of the commissioners, and I've worked with him on setting up the AI policy pretty closely. They are issuing rules about how workplaces need to treat people. So I think it's much more proactive, if you will, than just passing a law. Believe it or not, right? The other thing is the states are doing the same. So New York, Colorado State just is taking a law up to the governor this week. So all the states are for the things that are under their jurisdiction starting to come along as well.
Cool. Excellent. Thanks, Jack. And yeah, we do only have sort of about 30 seconds left. There was one last question about the possibility of doing impact assessments given the type of data and information and the scale. It seems to be near impossible. Yeah, absolutely. A rethink of how we do the privacy, security, and impact assessments is really important, because we're not going to be able to do them. The traditional PIA model is not going to work in this type of things, because by the time you've written it, even if you ask ChatGPT to write a PIA about itself, it'll already be out of date by the time it finishes it. So we do need to think about different ways to do these things going forward. But yeah, so thank you everyone for joining. Thanks, John. Thanks, Jack, especially for, it's about 10:15 at night for you now. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. I hope everyone has got something of value out of it. If there were any other outstanding questions or anything, then do feel free to reach out to me, paul@infobydesign.co.nz, and hopefully we can help to answer them. But otherwise, thank you for joining us. Happy Privacy Week, and we will talk again soon. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, John.